Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending. My name is Walter. I'll be subbing in for Al today. He wasn't available, so I will walk you through today's webinar topic, which will be starting here in a minute. I see we've got a good amount of attendees. So I'd like to remind everybody, if you have a question, just enter it in the questions option box there. You should see on the side of your webinar page. As opposed to the chat, it's just easier to answer in there. I'll try and get to all the questions, as we go through. If it's not covered in something in one of the current topics, then I can answer them at the end of the session. All right. Well, today's webinar, we're going to be looking at 5 types of solid editing. It's something that a lot of us will do is have to create geometry, 2D, 3D, and here are a few ways that we can go through and create this geometry. Like I said, my name is Walter. I look after the technical services here. Many of you have probably called our technical support team or dealt with some of our trainers. I've been at BobCAD for almost 9 years, and I look after those areas now. I'm sure, like I said, you've all had the experience of dealing with some of our technicians, so we all work together here to get you guys the answers. So today I'm going to be helping you with these topics. So what we're learning today, extrude boss, the extrude cut, the solid split function, the solid shell function, and the imprint function. So these are 5 sort of common solid manipulating tools that we have, and I think through the presentation you'll see how they can be useful for you. Here a couple of parts we'll see in a couple examples. We'll create something like this part here on the left, this gray one, using extrude boss, extrude cut, again something that's commonly used. The split function, top right, is something where you can take a surface and split an existing solid. Kind of really useful function there. We'll be looking at, I guess, another example there of an extrude boss and cut, kind of to get some what looks like complex geometry, but quite easy to do with the functions. The idea today is to go through each of those. And again, if you guys have questions, yeah, just let me know. All right, so let's get started with this part here. And there's a few different ways in BobCAD that you can create a solid. I'm going to focus on the extrude boss and extrude cut. I will mention a couple along the way, a couple of other surface commands, and just to kind of give you an idea of when you would use one or another. But really, the focus is on these functions. So extrude boss, let's start with that because it's a common one. What it does is it creates solid bodies by extruding closed wireframe chains or planar surfaces, and it automatically joins the intersecting or touching entities into a single solid. Okay, so what that means is if you're, I'll show you an example here of kind of how that works. I'd like to kind of get right into the showing part. If I'm going to use the extrude boss function, it's located here up on the toolbar if you have a standard default layout. It can also you can also get at it from our solids menu, solids extrude boss. Here's the interface for the extrude boss. You have a few options, okay? Pretty straightforward. It's asking you for the geometry. It'll ask you for the distance in a positive direction and the other direction. And you have the option to go along normal if you're in a different UCS view, or along the Z-axis. We'll leave this to along normal. We can touch on this a little bit later. And I already see a question in there. I think Gordon asked, extrude curve or extrude boss, what's the difference? Well, extrude boss, like I mentioned, is going to automatically join these intersecting or touching entities. So it's basically, if you want to keep them separate, then you'll use extrude curve. If you want to join them together, you'd use extrude boss. Let me illustrate that here. So extrude boss, the option here, what I'll do is I have to chain select. So the important thing is also is make sure your geometry is good. We get a lot of questions about my extrude boss is failing, or it's not giving me a closed shape. It's only giving me, let's say, almost like a thin wall, and it's not capped. When I say capped, top or bottom or ends aren't, it's not watertight, if you will. That's another way to kind of talk about it. So the idea is that geometry, maybe you have non-intersecting edges here, right? So trim or 2D tools would be used at that point. Trim two entities, or you want to delete a line, or maybe you may have to redraw a line if the geometry is poor. So just ensure that you have closed chains, though. That's very important. Going into an extrude, I'll chain select this part here, and that gives me a preview. The nice thing about the preview is you kind of see what you got, while you're working on the part. I have in here selected the lines that are selected. These are the lines for the entity selected for this geometry. If I click on them, you kind of see them highlighting. Maybe difficult to see, but they do highlight. It gives an idea of what's selected. I can select my distance and a draft angle. If, for instance, draft angle, if I put in 3 degrees, you'll see as I rotate this view that this shape is now taken on a 3-degree draft angle. So kind of convenient. In the past, you may have had to create 2 surfaces, a top edge and a bottom edge, and then connect them together, then skin this, maybe using some of the other tools. This makes it kind of easy. Let's leave this as an inch for now, because what I want to get at is that question that was asked earlier, is what's the difference? Well, extrude boss, while I'm still in the command, I'll change this to 1.5 inches, and I'll also extrude this part here. So what I have here is a model that's sort of all together. I canceled out of that function. This model is one piece now. Okay, so it saves of doing like a Boolean add afterwards. But if it is something that you want to do in one step, for instance, or sorry, if you want to do separate parts, well, then you could use the extrude curve, let's say something like that. I could create one shape, and then I could use extrude curve to create a different shape. I hadn't really intended on going into too much into that function for this webinar, but I just want to show you the difference. So you see, as I highlight them in selection mode, those are now 2 different pieces. There are reasons, depending on what you're designing and what you're working on, why you'd want 1 solid piece or 2 solid pieces, and it's kind of specific to the job, but just know that there is that difference. So Extrude Boss is going to bring those together. So let's kind of go back and kind of work through this part. So I'm going to use the Extrude Boss and also the Extrude Cut for this model to kind of quickly show you how to put together the part file. So as you saw before, let me call up this Extrude Boss function again. I'll bring this up. Let's say we'll make this 1.5 inches. Okay. Click OK. And then what I'd like to do is I'm actually going to cut some of these pieces out. Okay, and I'll use the extrude cut function for that. Okay, and that's located up here in the solids menu, extrude cut. And what extrude cut does, it removes material from the solid bodies by extruding the closed wireframes. Same as almost the inverse of the extrude boss. Okay, so what we can do here is, you see the interface looks the same, extrude cut, extrude boss, only they're doing the exact opposite thing. One is removing, one is adding material. So it's using this wireframe chain. So let me select this shape here. I can select multiple shapes. They will be tied together by a common, by their attributes here that we enter. You can also use our dynamic, push-pull, these arrowheads. So we can bring this up to a specific distance if we want, and they're both, they'll be dragging both of or any number of shapes that you select. This is tied to the snap increment here. So if you set a value, you can have that snap along to that distance. If you can see to the left here in my user interface, or in the data chemistry manager, it's moving by a 1/4 inch because I have that set. So it's kind of like a convenient tool. If you need to do something, it makes it quick. And now extrude cutting from that, what I'm left with is a void where that shape would have cut to that distance that I specified. While still in the function, I'll take these side pieces out. I can actually drag that through the part. You know, if I didn't know a specific distance, I can just drag it past the part. That's fine. Click OK, and now we're kind of moving along here with creating sort of our final shape. And let's continue to use the extrude cut in 2 different ways. I'll make like a little counter bore here. So I want to pick this geometry, but it's not quite highlighting for me, right? So there was a question there as far as picking geometry earlier. So the geometry here, in order to get at that, I can hit the S key on the keyboard, the shading key, and it sort of hides out the shading of the surfaces. So I'm able to then select this curve here. Whereas if I didn't have that on, the focus won't necessarily pick that. There's a couple ways to do this. Shading is the quickest way. Also, I always like to talk about organizing geometry. So putting things onto layers. That's important if you're doing something that's got a few different functions. Stay organized, create a layer. For those that are unfamiliar with it, I'll show that in a second, and we'll just kind of go create a layer. So here I'll pick the geometry that I want for that counter bore. I'll set the distance because I know I want 1/4 inch, let's say. Select OK. And then as I turn the shading back off, we'll see it here. Okay. And extrude cut. Let me go ahead and bring these through holes through. So select this geometry here. And again, I can just grab this arrow and pull it through. And off we go. So here's something that we have, completed little part, kind of simple part, but I think it shows a few of the basic steps to create a solid from 2D wireframe. So if you need to have a solid model, you can do it pretty quickly with this extrude boss and extrude curve. I'm going to show another example here in a minute of using it on different planes. So for instance, the layers that I mentioned earlier. So the idea here is organization. So I got this, busy part here with some with geometry. What I'm going to do is create a new layer. In the layer UCS Post Manager, there's a tab here on the bottom left. What I can do is I can right click and add new layer. It automatically puts me into a mode where I can name it. So I can, if I start typing automatically, like I can call this wireframe or original CAD, or depends what I'm trying to move, whether I'm trying to move the solid or I'm trying to move the wireframe. Let's just call it wireframe. Hit enter. The layer is created. Simple as that. I'll cancel out of this function so we can see. So in the wireframe layer, just a quick reminder, the black dot here, these radio type buttons, this is for hiding the contents in that layer. If we had this check mark here, this one makes the active layer. So if I uncheck this CAD layer, right, we'll see that everything goes away because everything is still in that layer. In order to hide it, you have to first click off of it being the active layer, then you can hide it. With this geometry set like this, let me select what I want to move to that wireframe layer. So I can go in, there's a couple different ways to do this, and this is something you may use when creating solids. You want to get things out of the way. I mentioned one of the ways to do that is hit the S key for shading, and that allows you to grab geometry. But let's say it's really busy on the screen, so you really want to make sure that you want to grab the entities that you're grabbing. Complex 3D models, you have a lot of lines, some close together, some almost on top of each other if you're depending on the model. So the idea is, organize and be able to grab this. So here what I'll do is I can go manually. If I want to blank out, let's say this solid, what I can do is use the blank command. And what that does is it hides it. It's a toggle. It's either blanked or it's unblanked. So if I highlight a part, right click and OK, it now becomes blank. that entity's sort of hidden. Okay, the layer can still be active, but the entity is hidden. When I click unblank, what it will do is it will show me all entities that are currently hidden. So then I would have to reselect the entity that I want to bring back. And there we go. So what I could have done there is, blank that, window pick the geometry on the screen, which would be the wireframe. That's all that was left. And then bring that to a new layer. What I'd like to do in this case, actually show, I can just go ahead and be in selection mode here. So the black arrow here. And then pick by color. And I can simply pick, because I know that my entities are all blue. And what that does is that just highlights all the blue entities, which happens to be my wireframe, conveniently. And then I can right click, modify attributes, and then layer. And then I'm just going to throw this onto this wireframe layer. And when I click OK, it's gone there. Nothing changes on the screen until you see me toggle this layer, right? So there it goes, right? So it's been sent to that layer. Just an organizational thing. I want to take a couple seconds to talk about that. Maybe most of you may be familiar with that, but organization will keep your models kind of clean, and construction of your models clean. As I mentioned also earlier, having geometry that joins, that's gotten free of gaps, duplicates, entities that have gaps, those are going to be problems for surfaces and solids. So you want to start from good geometry, and you will get good solids from that. All right, so if there's, I'm going to show another extrude cut and extrude boss, just kind of a quick one, just to show you from two different UCSs, or rather two different directions. If there's not a question about this part, I'll kind of move on here. All right, let's move on to a separate part here. Just bear with me, I'll load the part for you. Okay, so if everybody can see that now, I've got this kind of spoon-shaped piece and this kind of wave rectangle piece. And if you can see, they're on two different planes. One's on the, let's call it top plane, and one's on the front plane. So we can see if I highlight the front UCS, we kind of see what plane that's on. This one's on the top plane. So you can imagine what's probably going to happen here is we'll do a simple extrusion and we'll cut this shape across. Pretty simple, a couple steps, and we can have a kind of unique shape and complicated shape handled quite easily rather. So we'll use our extrude boss here. We'll pick our geometry like we saw on the other part, and we'll select the distance. Again, views are important. So you see me kind of rotating around a lot here. What I like to do is make sure that what I'm seeing, or where it's actually going, whether the part's coming past the bounds. I can toggle up here in our views. We have front view, top view, ISO views. There's shortcut buttons. Control-7 will give you an ISO view. You're going to want to get used to using the views. You're going to want to get used to panning and rotating the part. Very important when you're doing 3D, because you got to be able to get at the geometry or give it the perspective that you need in order to achieve that, whether it's a cut or a extrude boss. So just as a reminder, while I'm doing it, we'll talk about the views real quick. So again, views are set in the toolbar by default, or if you have customized toolbars. I know some of you like to customize the toolbars, and I encourage that, so using the tools that you kind of go after all the time. Otherwise, it's under view. You have your view options, and you can set your views from in here. Views, and then there are various views that you can, depends on what you need to see. So let's see. So what I'll do here is extrude this guy up here, and then we'll look at. I'm just dragging this up. Again, rotating this part by clicking the middle mouse button, pressing down by the middle scroll wheel rather. And then if I hold control and use the middle scroll wheel, it gives me the pan. So again, a basic thing, but very important for this type of work. So let's say I'm dragging this up a couple inches. Okay, you can kind of see where that that cut's going to be. So we got our one surface there, or one solid rather. We use the extrude boss for that. Let's go and extrude cut that across. You kind of get an idea of what's coming. So extrude cut. We'll select the part. Now you see it's going halfway because it goes from the plane, right? From where we're drawing. You can do this a number of ways. You can draw on one side of the plane. If it happens to be, then you'd be going one of the directions through the part. In this case, it's center of the part, so I'll set a value in positive and other. Add the same amount. We'll hit tab, and there we have, kind of a preview of what's going to happen. Click OK, and there's kind of our part. All right. So that's gives you an idea of how to create things like this. Sometimes the geometry is drawn just for a cut. So if you haven't used these tools, you got to think about, almost like a die, or in this case, you ensure that the shape that you're using to cut goes past your model. So in this case, I'm coming past the model a little bit, and once it's past the model, it really doesn't matter what kind of shape you make, as long as it's larger than the shape you're trying to cut. If you wanted to make some sort of revision, then yeah, let's say this is coming a little bit higher. Well, you'd want to make sure that your wireframe chain compensates for that, or is within size. Otherwise, it doesn't really matter what profile. So you could have a circle or half circle here. You could have really any shape. So as long as it's larger than what you're trying to cut through, it'll give you the result that you want. Are there any questions on that? Okay, let's look at a couple of questions here. Just bear with me. Yeah, there's a question from Mark. I want to make a void in a block, like a mold type of piece. Well, yeah, you can. Essentially, it's kind of what we were doing in the first part, where you can set the depth that you're coming down. So if you have any kind of chain, you'd be bringing it down into the piece and setting the depth. So I'm not sure if that answers that question. I can, see if I can string something together here. But as far as making mold type parts, there's a number of ways to do it. If it's something that's, symmetrical that you can revolve, maybe you're using a revolve cut, which kind of I haven't set to go over on this webinar, but extrude cut you could use for that. Yes, you just set the depth. So if you're not going all the way through, then you'd be setting your depth at which you want to remove that material up to. All right, so let's look at another part here. All right, so here's the part. I'm actually going to bring it into a new window. Right, so in this part here, what I'll do is I'm going to try to use the split command. Split solid is used to separate a solid body using a splitting surface. Okay, for this function, I'm going to select a single solid and one splitting surface. The software is going to automatically create multiple solids from that. So kind of as we saw in that initial image. just note that the splitting surface has to completely go through the part, so it can't be within the part. It's definitely got to go past the bounds of the part. Think of it as, something slices all the way through. It can't slice halfway through. All right, the first thing I'm going to do, and guys, I do see some questions coming in. I'll try and get to them here shortly, or maybe towards the end of the webinar. But I do see some of them come in. Thank you for submitting those. So this surface here, what I'll do is, before I create it, I'm gonna create a new layer, and I'll call it surface. Okay, and I'll create this surface here quickly, just using the. Let me see if I can use extrude curve for this one. So let me just create this surface. I can drag this one out. Just make sure it's past the part. Say something like that should be good. Okay, so I got my surface there. And let me extrude this other part here. So I'll blank that. In fact, I'll put this on that other layer. Okay, get that out of the way. And let me use extrude boss in this case. So, oh, no draft angle here. Kind of extend this so we can see. All right. Oh, you know what? I'll use extrude curve so it doesn't tie them together. Okay, so something like this, I should have one solid body right there, okay? And then I have my surface right here. All right, so let's look at the function. Solid split. There's not too many options in here. As you can see, it gives you kind of like a little image here of what's possible with it. So first I'm going to pick my solid, then I'm going to pick my splitting surface. Right click OK, and then when I have this, essentially, if I blank that out, you'll see that this is now two different surfaces, two different solids. So easy as that. Kind of does the thinking for you. If I drag this up, right, you get an idea of, instead of having to model those two, just model one. This is good because you can have complex sort of, splitting surfaces in there, and this can be from any one solid. So this, I happen to take this out of a block just to show, a simple example, but you can have, all sorts of any kind of solid shape. So, I want to keep like I said, I want to keep the example kind of basic, but to get an idea of what's possible. So again, that's solid split right here. Again, the steps were pick the solid, pick the splitting surface, and you have yourself two solids. Any questions on that? Okay. Let's look at the imprint function. The imprint function is something that was, it combines a couple different things. What you can do is it's designed to extrude a curve and subtract it from an existing CAD model. But then it keeps the original one there too. So it's like doing an extrude curve, Boolean subtract, but then also keeping both. And where it's used a lot for is something like soft jaws. And that's kind of what we initially found it to be really excellent for, and our customers have been using that. So let me show you a part file there, and we can go through it. All right, so for this part file, we'll use the imprint function. So the idea of the imprint function, it's located here under solids, imprint. Okay, it's asking us for kind of similar to the other functions. It needs a chain, a profile chain, and then we'll select the solid at which we wish to work with those chains on. So right now I don't have any chains in here, so let me create some. I'm just going to switch to a top view so you can see the part, and I'm going to make some soft jaws. Right, let's say I'm going to hold this part because I want to do some machining on it while it's clamped. So I'm going to use other and rectangle. This gives me, I'm going to make the geometry of, let's say my soft jaws are 6 inches by half an inch or something like that, or 1 inch rather. Okay, and let me position them up a little bit in Y here. Well, let's say something like that, or 1.3. Okay, that looks good. Okay, so I'll create one there, and then I'll create one. I can do both at once. So I'm creating these shapes. Okay, now I've created them below my part, so I can specify a thickness, because I don't want it to go all the way through. I want it to almost have a little ledge there, and I'll show you the differences as well of having it on the same Z0, or the same level rather, or having the part sitting up. As you can see in this example, if I look at this view, if it may be difficult to see and before I extrude it, but I'm going to have like a little ledge for it to sit on before I have the the cutout of the profile here. So let's have a look at imprint. So imprint function, we load that up there. We're going to select our profile chains, which in this case, 2 of them. One here, and chain selecting, again, shift and left click. And then I'll select my solid. Okay, and so you get a preview of what's going on. And I can pick a point of which you want to extrude that to. So any point on the model. In this case, I don't have a specific point, but I think I'm going to enter the distance. You can drag it so you can see what's going on. And if you can kind of view this in here, what you'll see is, that we will have a little ledge for it to be seated on, as well as, the outside profile. Let's say 0.625, that works fine for this example. So I'll click OK, and that's basically the function. What it will do is let me move these to another layer, since I didn't have that one selected. These are on 2. Yeah, okay, so there we go. So this is something that you can go in now and apply toolpath to right away and cut out some soft jaws. Again, the shape isn't overly complicated, but you get the idea of setting something up sort of quickly. So normally what you have to do in the past is, like I mentioned earlier, extrude a solid, then take the other solid, maybe do a Boolean subtract. Well, one of them goes away, right? The one that you're not leaving. So then we'd be left with this shape, but you'd have your original would be gone. So in this case, like, it does all those steps, all in one, and you're left with with this usable geometry that you can then program, maybe a profile cut in there, like an open pocket, or it depends on how your shape and your cutter size and so on. But you have a nice little seat here for your part, and then you can you'd be able to use that. The other option I mentioned there, or the other scenario where it's on the same level, if I can, I'll just translate it down, bring this part back down. Okay, so again, with this imprint function, them sitting on the same level, select the profile chains here, pick my solid, you'll see that if I blank this out, right, we see that goes all the way through. So it just kind of depends on how you want to set it up and how you want to, work with your part. There's another way that this imprint function can be useful, and I got a part file to show that. Okay, so something like this. This is where it's kind of neat. So what I'm looking for is an imprint of this piece, right? It's kind of like a question that was asked earlier, like creating a mold type of piece. I want this shape to be imprinted into another solid block. Okay, this is the profile of my block, this outside wireframe with radius corners. Okay, but I want the walls to come up, like a parting line will be up to this surface, right? So there's an option in Imprint that kind of handles that. So let's have a quick peek at that. So I'll pick Imprint, I'll pick my chain, I'll pick my solid, and I'll pick my surface, which I've hidden here. All right, so you see a preview of that. Now, okay that there, and let me hide the surface layer. And here I'm left with an imprint of this part up until that surface. So if I blank this guy out here, that's what I'm left with, aside from, also let me blank this out as well. Okay, so if we can see here from different views, looking at the top view, kind of hard to see, front view, right? So that surface was our parting line, and we still have our shape, which happened to be a tapered type of rectangular prism, or tapered sort of with radius corners. We're able to bring this right out of this part. So kind of instead of having to go in and manually build this up with surfaces, this kind of does it in just one step and 3 clicks. So I know I've seen, we've had customers ask for this type of thing, and this imprint function can be used more than one way. And I'll bring that one up again just to show you that was the end surface. So what it's doing is it's imprinting up to and terminating at that end surface. So what was required there was, I step that back. What was required was I need a closed chain for my imprint here, my profile chain. Okay, that's required. I need a solid body. That's what's going to be sort of subtracted from that extruded chain. And then I need my surface if I wish to do that function. I can use that surface. Otherwise, what that would look like is kind of like the first part. So picking our chain, right? Picking our solid, and then picking our distance. I'm not sure how high that is. Let's say something like that, right? So then that would be the other result, right? That would be the alternate result, kind of like you saw in the first part. So a useful function, right? Only the walls are, rather the top surface is flat, because I've brought it to a consistent extrusion distance. Anybody got questions on that? Okay, let's see. I want to talk briefly about the shell solid. So it's pretty straightforward, kind of a function. But let's look. I'll bring up our favorite shape library here. Let's just pick this triangle for an example. Something simple, just to get an idea of a shape. Let's extrude it. Okay, we got a little solid. So the shell solid's used to remove one or more of the faces of a solid body and recreate the solid with a thickness, like a wall thickness for the remaining surfaces. You can shell the whole solid also for it to be like a closed hollow solid, something that you may could be cast or something that's assembled where there's a hollow in the inside, but it's watertight on the outside, and it's got that a consistent wall thickness. So let's have a look. Function's pretty straightforward. It's also found under solids, shell. And what I'll do is I'll just pick, I can select if I want to do it inward or outward. I can select if I want what wall thickness and if I want to fill at the edges. And if I want to toggle a preview on or off. I'm not sure how thick, that may be too much. Let's start with this. So show the preview here. I'll pick my geometry, and we already kind of see a preview of what we can expect. Let's select 2. Give me 1 second here. There we go. Okay, so there we see an example of how it left 0.05 wall thickness. I just picked the one surface. If I want the whole solid, let me show you a difference on that. Let me cancel out of it. Back up. Right, we got our solid piece. If I press S for shading, right, it just gives me a wireframe. There's no thickness to it. So let's see if it'll work for the whole solid here. So whole solid, I'll pick this part. Right, so you won't be able to see anything as it stands. So let's do a shading. Now we can see that there's a thickness on all of the walls. Right. Another way to do that is you could use maybe section view. Let's see if that'll work. Let's see here. So something like that. So I generated the wireframe using a section view, and you kind of see that there's the wall thickness. Right. There's a few different ways to, depends on what you're doing, but this is kind of a good function if you want to create those kind of parts, rather than thinking of, the opposite is, without this function, you'd be creating, or you'd think to create the top surface, this top triangle, and extrude it a certain distance, and then the side surface and extrude that a certain distance and move on and so forth. Well, that's fine, but when the part gets complex, having just one function that handles that is easier. Okay. I think there was a question, how do you shell such that? How do you shell where the surface did not have a wall? Oh, what I did is I just picked that one surface. So what I had there is, if I back that up, right, I think it should be back to where it was. Instead of picking whole solid, I just picked the one surface. So shell, uncheck whole solid, just pick the one surface, and then now it's open. So it's kind of like an open box shape. I'm not sure if that answers the question there. But that's a way to kind of handle that. And just keep in mind, when you're working with these kind of shapes, you can use them all together. A lot of times you might have to. So in this case, if I were to want to create something now on this surface, I mentioned, organizing earlier with layers. We haven't really touched on UCSs. I will kind of just show one for this example. For those of you that are not familiar with creating your own UCS, I don't want to kind of run through it too fast, but given our time here, I want to just show a quick example. I'm going to add a new UCS, and I'm going to pick this orientation here. and because I want to show you, extruding a cut through here, let's say. So if I wanted to create an arc at coordinates, say the radius is something like that, and then x of ½ inch, that may work, y ½ inch, okay, good enough. So I got a shape here, and then I'll use my extrude cut, again, S for shading. I'll see if I can bring this down through here. If it cooperates with me, it should. And then turn the shading off. So now what I've done is I've used two different functions. Now I'm creating a more complex part. So you'll see, like, a lot of the time you would be creating geometry using these functions kind of back and forth. You may need to use, I used an extrude boss to create the initial triangle. Then I used a shell feature, and then I used extrude cut. Well, if we step back all these functions, I think there was a question on this, but let me turn this back off and see if I can get back to a solid. What I could have done is I can actually draw on this surface here, and then I could have done an extrude cut, right? I could have offset these lines. Again, that's creating geometry. That's an additional step. But then I could extrude cut and get that kind of a box shape, similar to what the shell gave me, providing it's, there was no fillets at the bottom, or it's, I can do it with a taper, where shell wouldn't handle it with a taper. So it's got to be a consistent wall thickness. I think there was a question on that. So if it was a tapered shape, I would do an extrude cut that comes, from within this part. I'd create a triangle that's smaller, and then I do extrude cut in a taper angle. If that didn't do quite, what it needed to do, or the shape doesn't lend itself to that, you may have to, in some cases, create from wireframe geometry and then maybe do a Boolean subtract. So the tools are there. It kind of just depends on the part. Mark was asking, where was the depth set? Mark, the depth, isn't set. It's just a thickness from the extrusion, so, or from the shell rather. So it's not necessarily a depth, it's a wall thickness that's consistent around the part. So all of these walls and this floor, which is also considered a wall, right? All of this is going to be the 0.05 or whatever number you set in there, right? If you wanted a different depth for this back surface, you'd have to do kind of what I mentioned earlier. You wouldn't shell it, or you may shell two surfaces and leave it open, and then you'd have to recreate something thicker. Or you do an extrude cut, what I just mentioned, offsetting, picking geometry, or creating this inner geometry and extruding cut down to whatever depth you want. Therefore, leaving the sides 0.05 and maybe leaving ½ inch. At that point, it's not much different than this part here, where you'd set a depth, and the wall thickness would be determined by your shape and its proximity to the outside of the part. Hope that answers that question. Let's see if I got anybody else got a question on maybe this part or anything similar. All right. Well, I'll try and get. I think I got most of these answered. If not, we'll get to some of them. I know Mark asked about how'd you cut a shape into the circumference of a shape. How'd you cut a shape? If you're looking maybe to cut around something, Mark, you may want to. It kind of depends. I'm not sure if you're looking to cut something like radially. If you had a cylinder, maybe you want to cut holes that are, norm or pointing to the center of that cylinder. What you can do is you can draw an extrude cut, and or before you extrude cut, you can do a rotate or a revolve around that shape and then do extrude cuts individually in towards the center, and you could set the depth. That's kind of one way that you could handle that. I'm not sure if that's what you mean. Otherwise, you'd have to create the geometry and maybe do a Boolean subtract. I'm not sure if that answers your question, Mark, but you could always just message us or send us an email, and either myself or Al can get back and maybe get a little example. We do like feedback, so any kind of questions, I know we usually send out some questions at the end. I'll try and send that out if I figure out how to do that correctly. But we'd like your feedback, the stuff you want to see. Any projects you're doing. I know Al loves hearing about the stuff that you guys are doing, so send him some cool emails with the stuff you're making. Marketing department loves that kind of stuff, so and we like seeing it. I know a lot of you guys have worked with our technicians, and we see some of your projects, and it's fun for us just as much as it is for you to kind of when you guys get those projects and out the door. That's satisfaction for us too. So if there's unless there's anything else, guys, thank you for spending your time here with BobCAD-CAM this afternoon. I know your time's valuable, so I appreciate it. I'll try and send out some questionnaire here at the end and let me know if you guys need anything. But otherwise, thank you for your time and take care.